welcome back to the channel. I want to talk about 3 recent posts on my Substack, drvinayprasad.com. 2 of them have to do with vaccine safety. 1 has to do with Elon and Joe Rogan. Let's get into it. The first one, kids. An FDA analysis of the primary COVID-19 vaccine series has found a concerning and preliminary safety signal. That signal is an increased risk of seizures and convulsions in toddlers, kids between the ages of 2 and 4 or 5, from receiving the mRNA vaccines. Now, this was seen with both vaccines, the Pfizer vaccine and the Moderna vaccine. This was seen in this very narrow age group. And it's a very tough signal to put your finger on. In my article, I describe the analyses the FDA has done. The reason it's so tough is, of course, there's some baseline rate of seizures that happen in young kids, often due to fever. There's also the possibility that getting the vaccine will increase the risk of a seizure in the immediate aftermath of the vaccine. Due to the vaccine, you might have extra seizures. Now, how many extra seizures would tank the whole program? This is a crux of the issue. Okay. In their analysis, one of the first things they do is they say that we're finding an increased risk of signals, an increased risk of seizures. We find this for both of these products. It tends to be in the age range of 2 to 4 or 5. It's all based on electronic health record data. So there's a big problem right at the outset. They may not be able to be capturing all the events. There might be seizures that are not being coded correctly, that are might being missed. So they might underestimate the events. One way you might check that if they're if they're getting things right is to take a known safety signal and look to see what's the rate of that in the data set. They actually did look in adolescent men. They looked at the rate of myocarditis. And they get a rate of myocarditis from the primary vaccine series of about 1 in 10,000. I had to do some back calculation in men. They actually don't separate men and women in their myocarditis signal. By the way, if you don't separate myocarditis men versus women, you're an idiot. And Ben Knudsen and I have published a paper where we show that if you don't stratify by age and sex and the specific product, you may miss a huge safety signal or trivialize a real safety signal. But putting that all together, I've actually separated men and women, and I make an estimate that roughly from the numbers in their paper, they're probably in the 1 in 10,000 ballpark. That's actually too infrequent. The actual rate seen in a number of series from Norway, from Hong Kong, from the Israelis is 1 in 3,000. So if you take a safety signal like myocarditis, and you don't find as much of it as you ought to find, then immediately when you find a different safety signal, you got to worry that you're actually missing a lot of it. Now, the safety signal for young kids that they find is seizures and convulsions. And this safety signal was present if you use 2020 as the base rate, but in sensitivity analyses, a secondary analysis using 2022, they say there is no excess of seizures using that analysis. But the problem with that is we're not sure the numerator is correct. Okay, we might be missing actual seizure episodes that are not being captured in the electronic health record data. But no matter what all these caveats are, roughly the ballpark we're talking about here for this increased risk of seizure is roughly the 1 in 10,000 ballpark. That's my best estimate from looking through the numbers in the paper. And the point I want to make here is that, well, what's the absolute risk reduction in hospitalization for a child in this age group to get the vaccine? In other words, it's possible. We don't know for sure. FDA doesn't know for sure that there's a 1 in 10,000 safety signal for seizures after getting the vaccine. Seizure's not good, by the way. Let's just stipulate that seizure's not good. Convulsion, seizure's not good for a child to experience. Is there a benefit on the other side of the ledger that's so much bigger than seizures that even if it was 1 in 10,000, it would definitely be worth it because we're preventing 1 in 10 bad event, we're preventing something extremely common? And the answer is maybe not, probably not. The risk of hospitalization to children when this program was debuted in 2021 was already very, very low. If a child had and recovered from COVID-19, the risk of being hospitalized due to COVID-19 was, we're talking probably 1 in a million kind of territory, 1 in 10 to the power of 7, okay? If they had and recovered from COVID-19. Even a little safety signal that occurs in 1 in 10 to the power 5, 1 in 10,000 safety signal is orders of magnitude bigger than the thing you're trying to prevent, okay? So to me, what's provocative about this paper is if it's even close, if there's even a hint of a signal here, your whole vaccine program is not just a misguided effort, it's actually harmful. It's actually a net harm to society. And it speaks so poorly of the FDA and this country and the CDC that they launched a vaccine program for the people at the absolute lowest risk, past the point of worst outcomes, past the MISC stuff. This is in 2021. That's when they actually debuted the toddler vaccine. They launched this program. They extolled and cajoled and pushed people to vaccinate their kids, even kids who had had COVID-19, and they have no clue. They have no clue if that effort actually has a net benefit to society. That to me is the problem. Okay, so whether you take the safety signal at face value, whether you're critical and you like the sensitivity analysis, the ballpark we're talking about is just too damn big. It's just too damn big. The benefit ballpark is orders of magnitude smaller, okay? So that's the problem with this paper. You can quote me hospitalization numbers all you want. You got to be quoting me hospitalization numbers due to COVID, from COVID, in the time span in which vaccination programs enrolled. That wasn't 2020, that was 2021. Okay, those numbers were a lot lower by then, okay? So to me, healthy child vaccinating, it was always a fool's errand. We wrote about this so much in the BMJ. It shouldn't qualify under emergency use authorization. There's no emergency in kids. That was Stefan Baral, myself, and Wes Pegden in the BMJ. We pointed this out over and over. I wrote an article in City Journal about they tried to bring this to market on the basis of an unplanned preliminary analysis of a secondary endpoint. This led to a call for a VRBAC, and then they rescinded the VRBAC when the curves started to drift closer together after all. It was a fiasco. Okay, you need to read my article in City Journal. It's called Another FDA Blunder. The regulatory events that occurred around the young children's vaccine were a total fiasco. It's a disgrace to the FDA. Anyone who follows the FDA will know it's a disgrace. And historians will look back and say, I can't believe they approved it based on such shoddy data. They ultimately approved it based on non-inferior mean geometric antibody titers, which is a piss-poor endpoint. Okay, point here, safety signal. If it's even in the right ballpark, the whole program is a net harm. Terrible, catastrophic error by public health authorities. Next paper. The next paper is a paper that looks at the risk of stroke in older individuals by the FDA. There was a preliminary signal seen in January of this year. There's a new paper that's looking at the increased risk of stroke. And what they find is they look in many, many ways. They don't find increased risk of stroke, don't find increased risk of stroke. And then suddenly, when you administer the bivalent booster and a high-dose flu shot together, there is an increased risk of stroke. And if you actually just looked at the high-dose flu shot, there's an increased risk of stroke across the board for older people who get the high-dose flu shot. What do I take from this? One, you heard people like Ashish Jha say, the reason God gave us two arms is so we can get our COVID-19 shot and our flu shot together. When he said that, he was literally pulling that from his ass. He actually had no credible evidence that administering these two shots together is sensible or logical. The second point, there's an ongoing randomized controlled trial of 150,000 people in Denmark that's going to adjudicate, probably, very likely, whether or not high-dose flu shots are better than regular flu shots in older people. And maybe they'll find the safety signal of stroke, which will be a catastrophic signal to find, because it would suggest that we embarked on this high-dose flu shot strategy and we might have done more harm than good. We will find out. We don't know the answer. There's a randomized study, thank God. They actually know how to randomize 150,000 people, which in this country we never did for critical questions around the pandemic. Ashish Jha made up the fact you can get both together. We actually don't have good safety signal data on that. And the final point I want to make to you here is that these two papers put together lead me to conclude the United States does not take safety seriously. We do not have a system in place where we can reliably detect 1 in 10,000 events. The myocarditis signal that we know is real, we have a lower estimate in this paper than they do from many other nations where they track these things more carefully. What am I to believe? Am I to believe the biology of Americans is different so it occurs less frequently? I don't think so. Or am I to believe that we're missing some cases in the numerator, and we might also be missing some seizures in the numerator? Much more likely. So I think if anybody actually cares about medical products, if anyone actually is a caring doctor, you want to administer products when there's a net benefit to populations, and you need to carefully either prove net benefit in randomized controlled trials. We didn't do that with kids. We didn't do that with bivalent boosters. Or in the absence of that, to have a safety system so robust you can detect a safety signal that's the same magnitude as the putative benefit you're chasing. We don't have that. It's a very interesting paper to me. Actually, you should read my two posts in Vinay Prasad's Observations and Thoughts. Third point. All right, the third thing. I listened to Joe Rogan and Elon Musk, and this was a late night conversation. They ordered pizza. People have been talking about it. Okay. They talk about everything. They talk about the Middle East. They talk about, colonizing Mars. A wide-ranging conversation. One portion of what they talked about was COVID-19 pandemic. They talked about 5 points, okay? They talked about, should we have had lockdowns? Did mask policies make sense? Did vaccine mandates make sense? They talked about, what were the other 2 points they talked about? They talked about whether or not there was iatrogenic injury from people from ventilator use. And then the fifth point they talked about, I'm going to jog my memory here, lab leak. Of course, lab leak. I went through these 5 claims, and I compared their point of view against Anthony Fauci. Somebody wrote back to me and said it's not fair because this is in retrospect and Fauci was in the heat of the moment. That's not fair either. If you follow Joe Rogan, you know his point of view on all these issues has been the same the whole time. So what is his point of view? 1, vaccine mandates. He opposed them. Joe Rogan said vaccine mandates shouldn't have been done. Anthony Fauci was actually one of the architects of vaccine mandates and supported vaccine mandates. By vaccine mandate, I mean that if you don't get a vaccine, you'll be terminated from your employment. And the Biden administration pressured many private employers to do it, and they actually used OSHA regulations to try to do it as much as they can. They got stopped a little bit in the Supreme Court, but not totally. That program, that effort to mandate that vaccine was medically unethical, unfortunately. In order to mandate a medical product to people, it's not enough for me to prove that that product benefits you, okay? That's not enough. The threshold is I have to prove that you getting that product benefits other people so much so that it justifies removing your autonomy for this particular decision. There's so much benefit to third parties that it actually allows us to intrude upon your decision making. You're allowed to make bad decisions for yourself. That's always been the case in this world. But I have to have so much benefit to third parties, it justifies loss of autonomy. They never had that. They never had that evidence in the beginning. And now we know that it absolutely didn't benefit third parties one lick. Everyone got COVID-19 anyway. And as a result, that was an unjustified intervention. Now let's talk about benefit to individuals. Is it possible the vaccine mandate benefited individuals? I think it's a very tough question. There are definitely some individuals who were harmed if you had and recovered from COVID-19 and you forced to get the vaccine mandate. It's not plausible that there was a benefit towards you. There's no evidence that there was a benefit to you. You were harmed. Some of these people were terminated from their jobs. If their lives are a little bit shorter because of loss of employment and all the things that happen from job loss, that has to be factored in the calculus. So we don't really know, I think, if there's even a net benefit to society from the program. But ultimately, you couldn't even do it. It's fundamentally unethical. Rogan, the point. Second point, lockdowns. Rogan is against lockdowns. Fauci's for lockdowns. I think it's unclear the net effect of lockdowns from a strictly utilitarian perspective. I think it is clear that it is a violation of democratic norms. It wasn't in pre-pandemic guidance. It's also clear, it's not clear how much additional benefit we got from the formal lockdown beyond the massive and voluntary behavioral change we got. Here, yet again, I would say Rogan gets the point. Rogan was always opposed to lockdowns. In fact, he moved to escape lockdowns. He moved to Texas. And Fauci was wrong by implementing a draconian measure that he learned from a totalitarian regime, masking. Elon Musk was the one who said, apart from specific situations like a surgeon wearing a mask to prevent spit from getting into the wound, masks have little role. And he was talking about at peak pandemic 2020, he was working in a factory with a bunch of people in the same room, and they weren't wearing masks. What would be the point? And some visitors came from California, they were wearing masks, they were shocked. Well, Anthony Fauci would have had you wear a cloth mask in that same room with the stagnant air for 8 hours, where Elon didn't. Here, the point goes to Elon. Of course, cloth masks don't work. Wearing a mask, even a surgical mask or even a high-quality mask, when you're doing it for hours and hours with the same people in the same room, doesn't make sense. There's going to be gaps. It doesn't even make sense. And certainly there's no evidence that would support it. And that evidence was never generated because they didn't run any randomized studies. Interesting. Lab leak. Rogan says lab leak was the most likely possibility, that Fauci lied about gain-of-function research. I think that's probably pretty accurate. Mechanical ventilation. The interesting claim made by Elon was that mechanical ventilation was done early and that accelerated mortality. I do not have evidence that it accelerated mortality, but what I can say, to Elon's credit, if he's going to say that doctors acted rash and did a lot of cowboy medicine that accelerated mortality, I think we do have evidence that that's the case. I think one can also ask the question, why did we intubate early? They did it because they wanted to limit aerosolization to prevent iatrogenic spread from COVID-19. There is no evidence that the policy actually limited iatrogenic spread. So the reason they were doing it has no evidence. Whether or not it accelerated death, I think, is a much harder claim to prove. I don't think I've seen convincing evidence of that. But again, the point is to Elon, which is that why did we do it? We did it out of panic. And I think he's right about that. That's what he said. So if you're doing a count at home, Joe Rogan and Elon, who are the mass purveyors of misinformation, versus St. Anthony Fauci, who is the media's darling, it's very clear that Rogan and Elon are much closer to the truth, in my opinion, than Fauci is. So those are my 3 recent posts on COVID-19 policy. Check out the Substack, drvinayprasad.com. Check out my Twitter. Stick to this channel for more updates. I got to go give a talk soon. I'm going to post that on this channel soon. I think you're going to like it. Until next time.